Hey guys, I hope that you are doing well. This is the Gauntlet edition of our walk through Genesis. We're at the Gauntlet this week, our student summer camp, and it's been a phenomenal week so far. Definitely a little exhausted on this Wednesday, but it has been well worth it. It's been an absolute incredible week. And so this week we're actually in Genesis 25 is where we find ourselves. We left off in Genesis 24 last week. And in Genesis 25, we see that even though Abraham did have other kids, he had other kids with this woman at the beginning of Genesis 25. Now where that happened in the timeline, it doesn't say, but Abraham did have other kids, and it said all of his other kids received some kind of gift, but it did said that Isaac received the blessing. And so one of the things we see here is that God does fulfill his promise to bless Ishmael. God does fulfill his promise to other people, but Isaac is the one. He is the elect patriarch, right? He is the sole heir of the promised land that God had promised to Abraham and now had promised to Isaac. And so we then find Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and Rebekah, just like Isaac's mom, was unable to conceive. Just like Sarah and Abraham back in the day, she was unable to conceive. And so what does Isaac do? Well, he prays. He unlike his dad, he doesn't try to take the situation into his own hands or solve it in his own strength. But what he does do is he prays about it, right? He prays about it. And barrenness here is simply this occasion for sovereign grace and this occasion for God's power and for them to have faith and to know that this is a supernatural thing, not a natural thing. And it leads us to know that Jacob, the story of Jacob that we're about to get into in the next several chapters, is a supernatural story. It has nothing to do with natural rights or natural ability. It is a supernatural story. It's about God. But I do think it's interesting that Isaac was 40 when he started praying for the barrenness to be removed. And they did not have a child. They did not have Jacob and Esau until he was 60. So it took 20 years for God to answer this prayer. It took 20 years for God to do what he was asking. And how many of us give up on praying way too soon? How many of us stop praying after just a little bit of time? We don't see it happen. When's the last time we prayed for 20 years about something and patiently waited on God's timing, patiently waited on God to do what we were asking him to do in the way that he wanted to do it, in the timing that he wanted to do it in? You see, Isaac was willing to pray, to seek God for a long period of time, and then to wait. And I wonder what would happen if we did the same thing. If we were willing to wait. If we were willing to pray for long periods of time, if we were willing to continue to ask the Lord to bring something to him and not give up after such a short time, I wonder what kind of things we might see as a result of it. And so she gets pregnant. The Lord finally answers his prayer after 20 years, and she gets pregnant, and she's feeling this battling inside of her womb. And so she inquires of the Lord, hey, what's going on in me? And the Lord tells her that there are two nations that are in conflict inside of her, and that the older was going to serve the younger. Now, this was a massive, massive deal, right? Because natural convention, the power, the conventional power arrangements were always the younger served the older. The younger, the older came before the younger. The older one had the birthright was 2/3 of in their case with two kids, they would have split it up into three instead of two, and the older would have gotten 2/3 of the material estate, right? The younger always served the older. So it's interesting that God here says that's going to change. That's going to be different in your case. And I think that's really interesting because I wonder how many times do we think that God has to give into conventional arrangements or how things normally work. God doesn't have to give into any of that. God can change whatever he wants to. God can do whatever he wants to. God can overcome conflict and conventional arrangements and all of those things. God can overcome any of that and do exactly what he wants to do. We're going to see in the story of Jacob a theme of blessing come through. Jacob was a man of blessing, but also a man of conflict, a man who is self-reliant, who seems to always be striving and grasping. He is a man who is flawed, but God still blesses him and uses him just like he can us, even though we are flawed. And so, listen, we don't know if this is just God's foreknowledge that he knows this is what's going to happen between Jacob and Esau, or if this is God's will and decision, that he is choosing what's going to happen. But we do know it has nothing to do with them. Why? Because they're in the womb and they haven't done anything. They haven't done anything wrong. They haven't had any actions. They're still in the womb, right? And so this is about God. This is not necessarily about them. And so we see a story at the very end of this chapter with these two boys that are born. Jacob, who was the one that came out second, the younger one, and then Esau, the older one. All right, remember, God said that the older was going to serve the younger, which is different than how naturally things worked in this day and time. And so God was going to change something. And so we see Esau is a hunter. He likes hunting. He's an outdoorsman, an avid man. Meanwhile, Jacob is a man who stays among the tents and does this kind of things. And one time they're probably out in the country, and Jacob's probably inside of one of the tent cooking some food, and Esau comes in and he's hungry. He's really hungry, and he sees Jacob making some stew, and so he asks Jacob. He says, "Listen, I'm starving. Can I have some food? Can I have a bowl of stew?" And Jacob tells me, "Well, yeah, I'll give you a bowl of stew. I'll give you some food, but you got to give me the birthright." Remember, the birthright in this case, because there are only two of them, would have been 2/3 of the material estate here. And Esau says, "Listen, I'm tired. I'm hungry. I'm exhausted. I'm famished. I'm probably going to die. I'm so hungry that I'm going to die," right? This reminds me of my kids all the time. My kids eat, and then 2 hours later, they're like, "I'm starving," and I'm like, "You don't even know what starving is, right?" But Esau comes in and he's famished, and he says, "I'm going to die." So maybe he thought, well, it doesn't matter if I don't get any food. I'm going to die anyways, and the birthright's not going to matter at that point, right? Because I'm not going to get to enjoy it anyways. And so he ends up giving his birthright away, the 2/3 of the material estate. He gives it away to Jacob. And so, listen, we see that Jacob in this case is very self-serving. He's very self-reliant, but we see that even among self-serving and self-reliant humans, God's purposes are still at work. That God is always going to have a voice, no matter what our motives are, no matter what we do. God is going to have a voice in what happens to us. He can change the way that the world is organized. He's free to work his will in the face of any human convention. His power is going to have its way. His grace is free and scandalous, and even people that are self-serving and cunning and clever, God can still give them grace and bless them, even though they don't necessarily deserve it. This is not about Jacob and Esau and whether or not they're flawed or not flawed. This is about God, that God does not give in to the way that the world is just naturally organized. God doesn't give in to normal power conventions. Not only that, but God doesn't align himself only with the obviously valued firstborns. Right? The firstborns were higher valued, and God said, nope, not in this case. The younger is going to be served by the older one, right? God does things that are supernatural. God does things that are unnatural, right? Jesus said the last shall be first, right? We are not fated to the way the world is presently organized when you're talking about the power and the grace of God, right? It just doesn't have to happen that way. And so we see that God cares about everybody, even cares about those that are considered last. And so in this story, we see human need and human cleverness and God's will and providence at work. We see that waiting and patience and faith are important. We don't want to give up the promise and compromise for easier short-term gain because we don't want to wait. We have to trust instead of accommodating ourselves. And really, that's the problem here with Esau. Esau was a short-term thinker. He was willing to give up a promise of something so much greater later because he wasn't willing to wait. He wanted to accommodate himself. His hunger in the moment was too strong that he was not willing to wait and trust and have faith that what was waiting for him on the back end, the birthright, was so much greater than that. Meanwhile, Jacob was a long-term thinker. He had faith in the blessing and promises that, hey, I want the birthright. It's going to be worth so much better than this stew, right? So Esau is a short-term thinker, not wanting to wait. He's impulsive, and Jacob takes advantage of his impulsiveness. Jacob's value was right. To value the birthright over the immediacy of filling our stomach is the correct value, but his method was off. But fortunately for him, God's grace can overcome human convention and our sin and conflict. You see, This story illustrates one of the massive problems, in my opinion, with humanity right now. It's that we want to fill our stomachs with this immediate need that we have. We're hungry, or we want this, or we want this, or we want this. And we live in a society where everything's given to us immediately, where everything's microwaved for us, where everything is quick, the internet is quick, food is quick, all of this. And it's not necessarily healthy for us, it's just quick. And so what ends up happening for so many humans nowadays is that we're not willing to wait on God's promises. We're not willing to wait on God's blessing. Instead, we take matters into our own hands. And we end up sacrificing long-term blessing. We end up sacrificing something that is long-term significantly better to fill the immediate need in our stomach that is not all that important. And so let's be people who think long-term, who are willing to have faith and trust and be patient in the process and in the promise and in the blessing, and watch how God uses that and deals with that in our lives. Don't give up something that is so much better in the long term for something just to fill a need or a desire in the short term. It is never worth it. I love you guys so much. Let's be a people who wait on God, who trust in God, who have faith in God, who are patient in God's timing, trust in His power, His grace, His will, His providence, and see how it turns out for us in the long run. We'll see you next week.